The birth of a superpower is a puzzling event. How does a nation even become a superpower? And what qualifications did the United States have that entailed its ascension to the title of superpower? Unfortunately, many historians still don't know what made the USA so special. Its constitution, perhaps? Its founding? Our size as a nation? Our ideology? There hasn't yet been consensus as to which is the most likely answer. The fact of the matter is that the United States became a global superpower after World War II. In addition, the actions of our fellow superpower, the Soviet Union, led to a pseudo-war known as the Cold War that would last until 1991. This brings us into period 8, which is going to be 1945 to 1980. It is worth 15% of your AP exam in May. So, let's get started with our discussion. Let's ask ourselves, how was the United States responsible in causing the Cold War? Well, here's my answer. The United States was responsible in initiating the Cold War with the Soviet Union during the post-war period because of its actions that resulted in tension building, fear of communist expansion, and foreign policy changes. However, the Soviet Union was also equally at fault for their expansionist policy and aggressive diplomacy. If you look at the Cold War Beginnings document, link in the description, you will see the different events that occurred that will answer this question for you as well. Now, Truman had a bone to pick with Stalin after World War II, of course, and he did not know how to handle him as well as FDR had done. Now, the Cold War was an ideological war that never heated into actual conflict between the two major players, hence why it's called the Cold War, because it never heated up. So, there were what are considered proxy wars, a war instigated by a major power which does not actually become involved itself. So, like the Korean War is the best example of a proxy war during this time period, and you can learn more about the Korean War in the Korean War document in the link in the description as well, so go check that one out. Now let's discuss the presidents first, from Eisenhower to Nixon, and their policies as well. So, Eisenhower, a war hero, became the next president after Truman. So many people liked Ike, which was his campaign slogan, that he destroyed the Democratic candidate, Adlai Stevenson, the governor of Illinois. When he assumed the office, he attempted to balance the budget after years of federal deficit spending. He referred to his policies as modern republicanism, which displays his leniency towards already established liberal programs like Social Security and welfare, because a lot of his friends were on those programs as well. So he passed the Interstate Highway Act, which led to the construction of many of the interstate highways on which you drive every day, so that's nice. This created jobs as well in construction and architecture, bringing many people out of poverty through government jobs. So again, a liberal policy. It also accelerated the automobile industry after it had slowed down during World War II. Now, Eisenhower was a fighter. He fought off a heart attack and had major surgery, yet still was able to win the 1956 election against Stevenson once again. However, the ex-military hero was not the forefront of his Cold War policy. Instead, it was the advice of John Foster Dulles, his Secretary of State, who shaped U.S. foreign policy throughout his presidency. Dulles criticized Truman's policies as too passive and advocated instead for massive retaliation. Now, massive retaliation is the placing of a greater reliance on nuclear weapons and air power than on conventional arms such as the military and the Navy. Now, Eisenhower, in the meantime, kept his election promise to end the Korean War and drew up an armistice, re-establishing the status quo at the 38th parallel, known today as the DMZ, or Demilitarized Zone, where people are killed if they try to cross it. So, not a very peaceful status quo, but still status quo nonetheless. Eisenhower also termed the domino effect for the series of events in Asia regarding the spread of communism into Vietnam. He also created the Eisenhower Doctrine, which pledged economic and military aid to any Middle Eastern country threatened by communism. In his farewell address, Eisenhower warned against the continuation of the arms race and believed it would devastate society if they were to be engulfed in this military-industrial complex. During the Cold War, the United States continued to maintain its containment policy of preventing the spread of communism into foreign nations. However, between the 1950s and the 1960s, foreign policy shifted from aiding Southeast Asian resistance against communist uprising to remove Soviet influence from the Western Hemisphere. Furthermore, American activities against the Soviet Union became more intimate and interventionist over time. The next president was John Fitzgerald Kennedy, known to us as JFK, his initials, who beat the Republican nominee, Richard Nixon, due to the television coverage of the debates between them. People who did not watch the television supported Nixon, while those who did supported Kennedy. This is because Kennedy, although his voice was tainted with a thick Boston accent, looked young, strong, and confident, while Nixon was sweaty and decrepit, but his voice sounded confident. Kennedy changed the course of the Cold War diplomacy immediately with his Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. This invasion was a CIA operative in which Cuban exiles were sent to overthrow Fidel Castro's regime in Cuba. It failed, of course, since Castro came to power anyways, because he just wouldn't die. No matter how many assassination attempts were plotted against him, he just wouldn't die. Also in Cuba was the Cuban Missile Crisis, the most dangerous challenge from the Soviets. Luckily, no nuclear missiles were launched, but a new crisis line between Washington, D.C. and Moscow allowed for communications to occur immediately during such crises. Kennedy also called for what was known as flexible response, the exact opposite of massive retaliation advocated for by Doles. Instead of using this massive retaliation and reliance on nuclear weapons, Kennedy insisted upon spending on conventional arms and mobile military forces. Unfortunately, JFK was assassinated in 1963, supposedly by Lee Harvey Oswald, who was murdered 2 days later on live television. His vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, took control 2 hours later. Johnson was determined to expand the social reforms of the New Deal with his plans of a great society. With his war on poverty, Johnson wanted to aid the poor in the nation with social welfare reforms, just like the advent of the New Deal. So in 1964, Johnson beat Republican candidate Goldwater with his Daisy ad. In your heart, you know he's right, but in your guts, you know he's nuts. Johnson is credited mostly for the advancement of Vietnam with his Gulf of Tonkin resolution. The Tonkin Gulf resolution allowed Johnson to spend and commit troops without the approval of Congress, also known as a blank check policy. If you want to know more about the Vietnam War, you can visit the Period 8 Notes document, which is also in the description, or you can look at the transcript for this video, which is in the description, and you can click on that instead. If you want to read the transcript for this video, which is just going to be all the major points that I make. It's not going to include any of the off-script points that I make that might be interesting or fun facts, but they're not going to be contributing to my major discussion. So this is the script right here. I would recommend looking at the transcript in the description below. So let's move on. So as you look at the period notes for Vietnam War, just remember, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Okay, with that out of the way, let's move on to Nixon. He appealed to the silent majority with his promise of a plan to end the Vietnam War swiftly. His promise was false, however, and he ended up just destroying the Cambodian government which led to the genocide of a third of the population. His story concludes with the Watergate scandal, because he was insecure despite his inevitable victory. He thought he was going to lose, despite the fact that it was 100%, despite the fact that all the polls said otherwise, he still thought he was going to lose. Because I believe he had an inferiority complex after what happened with JFK. His re-election committee had attempted to possibly bug the Democratic Nomination Center at the Pentagon, but they were busted, so not good. They were found out. And this led to a series of events that ended with Nixon's resignation, Gerald Ford's ascension to the presidency, and Nixon's pardon. Ford ended the Vietnam War in 1975. Nixon was not a terrible president, despite the blunder with Watergate. He relieved the country from the gold standard which plagued foreign trade, and his fiscal policies influenced Ronald Reagan to switch from Democrat to Republican. Now, Ronald Reagan was originally a TV star, but then he became a politician in California after Nixon's policies, I believe. Or it was either Nixon or Eisenhower. I think it was Nixon, but it could have been Eisenhower. I know that both of them influenced him, but I'm not sure which one was the more contributing influence. Now, rest assured, knowing that Nixon is not a crook, which is a joke because that was a speech that he made regarding the what happened at Watergate, and he said, well, I'm not a crook, and it became a meme, so yeah. Now we're going to get into the civil rights movement. You know what was different about the mid-19th century? The activism for civil rights started actually making physical change in American society. It started with the Warren Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, which established that segregation in schools was unjust and violated the pretense of the separate but equal clause or doctrine in the Plessy versus Ferguson case. Start here. Although integration did not occur immediately, Eisenhower used his executive power to enforce the decision, such as with the Little Rock 9 issue. This is the first time these civil rights laws were being enforced in the southern states. Now, the northern states were not angels. In the South, segregation was required by law, known as de jure segregation, and the North segregation was implemented by practice, known as de facto segregation. They are equally as bad, by the way. There's no difference between them. They're both systemic racism and they're both a problem. So, despite their differences, all of America was kind of racist. So, this is why the civil rights movement was so prevalent everywhere in the United States. There was systematic racism throughout the entire nation, not just the South. This is why the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is so important. It represents a national shift in culture. Why did this shift occur? The advent of the television led to the ability of people to see the protests of the civil rights activists. This, along with the concept of homogenized society, led to the development of the movement, resulting in its success. Despite the attempts for civil rights beforehand, the 1950s represent a significant stride in civil rights activism due to the new connections between the people of the nation through these new technologies. Now, since I don't have that much time to go into too much detail, I'll end the discussion here. I recommend researching more about the civil rights movement society during the 1950s and 60s, the Red Scare, the counterculture, and all that other stuff, and the Vietnam War. I would also recommend looking up Korean War, looking at the documents that I'm going to give you in the description below, as well as within the transcript. And just remember, guys, period 8 is 15% of your AP exam. So remember, and good luck.